Howdy, this is Ari Danish with Side Effects, and today I'm going to take you through a terrain masterclass, specifically our new H17 features. We're going to go through the new erode operator, which is much more accurate, realistic, and efficient, even faster than 16 and 16.5. And then we're going to take you through the scatter operator, which has been completely rewritten. It's now hierarchical, which means it's great for placement of villages, trees, and rocks after you created your terrain. And we have a few other new height field operators that we'll go through too. So what are we going to cover today? Well, we'll start with a very basic workflow. And this is specifically for people who are new to terrains in Houdini, or are interested in kind of how I approach building terrains. It's not going to cover any of the really cool features like masking or time-independent erosion. That will be covered in height field erosion in detail, our next section. So if you notice that our UI for the erosion in detail has changed dramatically, we now put up all the main parameters needed for erosion in the basic tab. And then once you have that kind of locked down, everything to make the fine details exactly how you want your erosion to look are in the Advanced tab now. And then we'll just quickly go over some stuff in the Layers tab that might be helpful in your workflow and the Visualization tab. Once we understand erosion, we're going to go to the new height field flow operator. If you remember in 16.16.5, flow was calculated within the erode node. Well, it turns out that flow did not need to be calculated on every frame. That's slowing down erosion a bit. So we promoted it to its own operator. You use it post erosion, and there's some other neat little features or workflow things that you could do with flow to, again, tweak your terrains to what you exactly need. Once we're finished with kind of the erosion part of terrain, we'll start talking about scattering objects onto the terrain. And that's where our new height field scatter comes in. We had in our previous versions a height field scatter, but this one is completely rewritten. And it's really cool because it has, besides a hierarchical approach to it, which means you could drop down villages and trees and rocks and bushes, whatever you need. It also has things like what is the radius and what is the fall off of these points, so you don't have intersections. And as a bonus, these points, when you add another scatter, are not floating around the surface. They're pretty much locked down. And we'll finally finish off this video by talking about a few small notes. The erode precipitate, erode hydro, and thermal, which really are the kind of the foundational roots of the actual erosion operator, but we'll talk how you could double up on them and emphasize certain parts of your terrain, or your erosion, I should say. And finally, we did a couple little changes in the slump, and we'll talk about those too. And along the way, we'll talk about a few new operators that we created. Okay, let's talk about a very basic workflow. So here's my basic workflow that I use, and we'll go through it quickly, in this keynote presentation, and then I'll go over to Houdini and actually do it. So I always start with a massing model, and a massing model can be something that you paint in. You can use 3D geometry. You can use a LiDAR data, whatever you need to create something that's very basic. And so you can see here, I'm just using a paint to mask out an area that I want to have my noise fill in. And you can see the noise filled in right here to make my massing model. And yeah, it looks like garbage. And it's supposed to look like garbage because it's just a massing model to fill up space. Now, once erosion starts, it needs what I call seeds. It needs obstacles for the erosion to hit and bounce off on and change kind of directions a bit. If you don't have those seeds, erosion kind of looks boring. It just kind of falls from the top to the bottom. It just follows perfectly the slope of your hill. So to break it up, I do what's called seeding, and seeding can be done with either, let's say, a height field noise, a height field distort by noise, or our new operator, which we'll talk about, height field distort by layer. Okay, so I seeded it. And I should mention this is at really low resolution. I'm not, pumping up the resolution of my terrain at all right now. And the reason why is my next operation I want to do is what I call lobing. And lobing is really important to me because when you especially use 3D geometry or just paint things in quickly, what you get is kind of this big chunks of terrain. And if you drive down a mountain range and you're looking at it, it's really broken up into these kind of lobes that are, had major erosion or major waterways or glacier ways cut into the mountain. And before I do my detailed erosion, I want to do that cutting to make those lobes. And so that's what lobing is. It's just a really low resolution erosion that tries to cut into those main features. So here's, lobing at two different angles. And then what I do is I often remap. So I'll artificially increase the elevation of my erosion to something higher than it would be normal in real life. And the reason why is if you think about erosion, the steeper the angle, right, it's the water's going to flow harder. You're going to get these, really deeper grooves. And I want to play with those deeper grooves. And then I want to squash it down and start to build up layers of the mountain. If you think about it, if you look at this picture here, I want to take this area, which might have been an actual hillside going across here, and squash it down, but still have really interesting detail going around it. And then I could add another layer after I remapped it down of another massing model of more mountains that are a higher elevation. And I could do that 2 or 3 times until I build up a nice, ramp up from low elevations to the very steep high elevations. Once I go through this process and get all my lobing done so I have these nice big breaks and chunks, then I'll sample up my height field to something more realistic, something that has a lot more detail. And in general, I'll do that a couple of times. So I'll sample up and I'll start to shape it. And what I mean by shaping it, right now, if you do an erosion, it's kind of going again straight down the hill. It's following the angles, it's following the lobes, and I want to start distorting it. Maybe have it have some swirls in it, something that makes it much more interesting. And again, a height field distort by layer might be a really good use case for that, but just something to shape it a bit. Once I do that, a little reseeding to add a little more obstacles for the erosion to hit, and then I'll start doing my real erosion. So here I am doing my real erosion, and it's looking okay. And I'll follow this process maybe a second time. So in total, I'll have 3 erosion passes. A low pass, which I call the lobing, which goes super quick, multiple frames per second, to maybe a second per frame for once I crank it up a bit, and maybe 2 or 3 seconds per frame once I get it to full erosion. As I'm going up, I'm also starting to play with the precipitation with the rain, and I'm also kind of starting to make the channels of the rain closer together so I get finer and finer teething of that erosion. And then the last step is the shaders. So I went from something that looked like this to something that looked like this. So what is a massing model? Well, according to Wikipedia, massing refers to a structure in 3 dimensions, its form, and not just its shape. Massing influences the sense of space which the building encloses and helps define both the interior and the exterior shape of the building. So that's for architecture. Now, how do we apply it for terrain? Well, for terrain, what we're going to do is we're going to use things like, let's paint our height and just get the general shape of what we want the mountains to look like. Or use 3D geometry and a height field project to project down shapes that will make the kind of the basic structure of the mountain. Or use 2D images like GeoTIFF or just plain old PNGs or LiDAR, anything that you can get to extrude up the height field into a mountain range. So why don't we see how that works in the real world, or in Houdini, I should say. So the first step is the massing model. So I'll just go down here and drop down a height field. and hit space G so I can see the whole thing. Right now I'm at the object level, so I'll dive into the geometry level, and there's my height field. And I'll keep it at the really low resolution of a grid spacing of 2, and it's a 1K by 1K geometry. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is drop down a height field paint. Just wire it up. And the layer by default is mask, which is what I want. And got a foreground value of 1 and a background value of 0. Fine. I'm going to change the radius to probably something like 100. Just have a bigger brush, maybe even bigger than that. Let's say 230 to start with. And I'll just start painting. Left mouse button down. And I'll just create something. And I'll decrease this to 100. How about that for terrain? Okay, then I'm going to go here and say height field noise. And if I just do a height field noise right now, you can see that it's creating noise over the whole height field. The second input here is a mask. So I'll just wire it in, and now you can see that I'm just generating noise over that mask. So if I look at my height field noise, I can increase the amplitude. And this is something I actually usually like to do. I like to exaggerate it in the beginning. So I have something that looks like that. And element size, you can make it more detailed, less detailed, whatever you need. I'll just keep it like that. And that's one way of making a massing model. Another way to create a massing model is to actually use real geometry. So for instance, I could go in here and just drop down a torus. And I'll make the torus here maybe 150 meters in radius. And I don't know, 75. Let's make it a little bigger, 200. There we go. And to this torus, I'll put a transform. Just like this. So I could do things like rotate it. And then I'm going to use a height field project. So the first thing I want you to notice here is that when I do a height field project, it has one green input and one gray input. So up to now we've been using these green inputs, which indicates the volume. So the height field project is saying it wants a volume, and it also wants a geometry. When I do that, you can see that indeed this geometry has been projected on to the surface of the height field. Okay, so I could go in here and just really crank up the resolution. It's not going to matter because I'm just going to project it onto here to make it smoother. And the other thing to notice is right now, if I go here and do a transform, it's going onto the positive projection. But if I try to go into the negative, nothing's happening here. So if I want to do the negative, it's quite easy. On a height field project here, I'll say turn off hit farthest, and combine method, I'll make that into the minimum. And now you can see that I've projected it down. So let's make it a little more realistic. I'll just make this a little shallower. Something like that. Okay. Other things I could have done here as I'm building up the massing model is right now that's really smooth and probably not realistic, is I could have done a height field project not on the height field noise, but directly on the height field itself. So I have something like this. Then I could do a height field distort, and this time I'll use it by noise. And you can see I can organify that projection here. Again, amplitude of it, the element size, if I want it smoother or a higher frequency noise, anything you want to do to make it look much more interesting. And then it's very much, height fields are very much like working with a compositing app. I'll use a height field layer. And if I look at the inputs here, it says the base terrain. Well, I'll say that's, well, in this case, it really doesn't matter, but I'll put this guy here and this guy for the terrain to layer. And then the operation here I'll say is add. And now I have something that looks like this, which is already starting to look like a very interesting massing model. I resized my panels here because I wanted to show you a third way of bringing in data to create a height field or to add information to your massing model. And that is to bring in an image like a GeoTIFF, a PNG, or LiDAR. So here on my desktop, I have this guy, the Gale Crater. And what I want you to really notice here is if I go Command I, two things here. It's rectangular, and our height field is square. And it also has a lot more resolution. And this will cause us problems. Where's the resolution here? 2883 by 3395. When I try to layer the two height fields together, I'll get border issues. So we're going to have to fix that. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to drop in a height field file. And the height field file can either be a file on your disk drive, source equals file, or you could create a COP and bring in information and filter it through a COP and bring in the COP. Right now, we just got a file. I'll go click here to get it, and it is the Gale Crater. I'll say accept. And there's my Gale Crater. And the first thing you'll notice here is that, well, it's still rectangular, which is a problem. And the other problem is the height scale is set to 1. And because, hey, this is a huge file, that's going to cause me issues also because I can't see 1 meter at such a huge scale. So I'll just bring it up to whatever height I want it to be. Again, I'm not using the Gale Crater to be accurate here. I'm just using it to fill in some information in my massing model. So that takes care of issue 1 of the height. The next issue that I have to take care is about, well, I really can't use this rectangular piece of information. And let me show you why. If I drop down here at a height field layer, take my original guy here, and then try to composite this on top of it, I'm going to get these streaks because they're different information. And if I reverse this, make this terrain, make this the base, now I got a rectangular base, which is not what I wanted either. So let's get that back to here. What can I do? Well, in the height field file, I could change here the size method, which by default is size of the largest axis, to just grid spacing. Okay, and then the grid spacing, I'm going to really decrease this because that's really low resolution. Let's say to 1 to start with. Gives me some information. Try 0.5. Okay, that looks like I got most of the information back. And now, as you can see, in my height field layer 2, I don't have these border issues. Oh, well, actually, I didn't show you that because we got to add the 2. But now you can see that that looks like it filled in some really nice information for me right there. So just to drive the point home about massing models, here's an example that I did. Here's my massing model. It was just me painting a mask and filling it with noise. And you can see it really doesn't have any structure. It just has the general waypoints here of the noise. And from this, to go very quickly to the final model, where you can see you got lots of fine erosion detail, a lot of fine feathering. It's just a nice approach to use. So the next step in this workflow is seeding, the process of taking a smooth surface and adding disturbances to create realistic erosion. When you use noise or projection geometry, often it does not have enough of those obstacles to create interesting erosions. So seeding will add those obstacles. You can do it a couple of ways. You can add some height field noise to a projection geometry to add a little layer of noise on top. You can use a height field distort by noise, which is, was already in H16 and 16.5, or you can use the new distort by layer. And distort by layer is really cool, and I think a little demonstration over distort by layer over time. So here I already have an erosion, as you can see, taking place, and I want to just add some distortion. And you can see over time, it's like if I'm moving tectonic plates. So let's do this in Houdini. For seeding, we already talked about height field distort by noise. That was this guy right here. So this time let's talk about a height field distort by layer, which is new. So I'm going to just drop down a height field distort by layer. And you'll see that it takes two inputs. The first input is the layers to displace. And the second one is going to be the control layer. Now, the easiest way to do this is either take already a noise that you have, or just take a height field, and let's drop down another height field noise. And I really want to mess up kind of the directions here. So my height field noise, I'm going to change the noise type from sparse convolution to, let's say, I don't know, a Manhattan Worley. Let's go really bizarre. And what I notice is that I really don't need so much amplitude. I'll just decrease it. And a good general thing to do, as kind of a rule of thumb, when you start out is whatever your amplitude is, make it your element size. It somehow has a nice balance that way. And just start playing from there. So I got this, kind of bizarre mechanical noise here, and I'll input it into my height field distort by layer. When I do that, you can see we're not getting much of a difference yet. But what I could do is now change my display scale and start to increase it. And as I increase it, you can see that I'm starting to get those mechanical elements into this guy. And I could also change the rotate displacement so if you're thinking about it, it's going on the normal, the displacement. This is just rotating it out. So you can play with it like that. Where do you want it to rotate in? And there is also a displacement node called swirl, which will automatically take it 90 degrees from where it was before, plus whatever your rotation displacement is. And you can start to create these geologic formations that are quite cubic in this case. And again, that might not look really good here as a massing model, but remember, I'm kind of looking for what is the bedrock? Is there granite sheets underneath this? And this can be very realistic as far as the slabs underneath the dirt. So I'm liking this. And I can add smear if I don't want it to be so hard. Just kind of blurs it a bit. Also, I have a control blur radius. So I can really control this and just get these little smooth edges here. Or I can go and, get them to be sharper. It really doesn't matter. Again, I'm just adding these seed values. And what were seed values is ways to make sure that I'm breaking up the terrain. So when the debris and the water starts flowing here in the sediment, it has areas to bounce off of and start become interesting. Okay, so that's seeding. So we're up to lobing. And remember, lobing is just your very first low resolution version of erosion. And what I'm trying to do here is to break up the mountain into these big globular sections that will look like it's different pieces of the mountain that then we could do high precision erosion off of. So let's look at that. Okay, the first thing before I do a road is I don't want the mass to carry through. So I'm just going to do a height field mass clear. So, it's back to the ugly gray. Then I'll do a height field of road. And the road model is, one of our key elements of H17 that we really worked on to make it realistic. So here we go. First thing I'm going to do is, I guess, I'm going to move this out again so you can see it a little better. And let's zoom out here so you can see that. Okay, visualization tab is the first thing I'm going to hit. I'm going to say compute range. And right now it's between -147 to 140. That's fine. And I'm going to go here, and I really don't like all the greens and the whites. I just kind of like doing something like this. Just want a little visualization. And if you like that, you can always go here, edit, say preset, browns. Okay, so here I am. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go here to my main. Now, let's actually run an erosion without any changes in the default settings here. So I'm going to make sure I turn on this guy. I want every frame calculated, so I'm going to turn on the real time. I'm going to run this, and you can see it runs really quickly. And you really don't need it to run it more than 20, 25 frames now. And I'll stop it at frame 25. How about that? I'm going to look at it, and you can see that it's creating these little globs here, but it's not doing much on top here to chisel it out, and not getting much detail at all yet for my lobes. And the reason why is the defaults are made more for the high resolution when I want to kind of keep my mountain tops intact and let the debris go down further, but I don't want that here. I want to just really start to cut this up. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to my advanced tab here. And the first thing I'm going to do is erodibility adjustments. And there's 3 parameters here: ramp up iterations, initial factor, and slope factor. So the ramp up iterations say how many basically iterations before we get full erosion. So if you think about the water sediment going, it's not going to cut into the mountain immediately. It's going to take a little ramp up. Then it says, well, how much do you want your initial to be? Well, we're going to say it's going to be basically half strength, the erosion. And then the slope factor is, should we have erosion where it is shallow, or should the real erosion be really where it's steep? So right now it's saying where it's steep, we're going to have a lot of erosion, and where it's shallow, we're going to have little erosion. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this. I'm going to change ramp up iterations to 0. So I'm going to say, let's hit erosion immediately. And the initial factor, 0.9. You can even make it 1. And slope factor, I'm going to say, 0.2. Let's give that a try. So I'm going to say, I want erosion everywhere. And let's reset this and let it run. And now you can see that I am getting a lot more detail and a lot more erosion here that we had before in these little guys here. And that's what I want. I want to just create these lobes that are interesting for higher resolution to occur. What else could I do? Well, if I'm seeing that there's too much debris buildup, okay, which is what I want, it's realistic, but maybe I don't want to see it. I want to see actually the channels. I could go over here to and where are you? Riverbed sediment capacity, and I'm just going to over crank that to 20. So let's just zoom on in this area here and reset, and again run it. And now what sediment capacity says is how much debris can be carried by the sediments before it settles down and makes debris. There we go. And now I'm getting the channels that I want, the lobes. Okay, so I'm liking that now. And new to H17 is instead of doing a time shift, I can say just freeze at frame. And I'll say I'll freeze at frame 25 here. And I'll just go freeze frame. And now you can see that I got this intact. Which is pretty cool. If I were to unfreeze it, you can see it's all gone. I'm going to do one more thing here. I'm going to go back to my, let's see, going to go to my thermal erosion. And I'm just going to crank up removal rate a little more here. And I'm going to go here, and we'll talk about that later. And what else do I want to do? And slope factor 0. Just let everything be eroded. Let's just run it one more time. Okay, here it is. I'm going to freeze it at 25 again. And I'm really happy with that. I'm even starting to get these little nice, sharp thermal cut-ins that I wanted. Everything's looking good there. So the next step in my workflow is often to do remapping. And I think it's a great trick to build up your terrain in elevation passes. Remember, the steeper it is, you're going to get kind of, more water flow going down. You're probably going to get deeper cuts. So what I like to do is exaggerate it, as I said earlier, and then smash it down to create kind of these different elevations or different layer elevations. And then I could repeat this process of creating a massing model, seeding and lobing, another pass to just build it up, or maybe 3 passes total, depending on the complexity of the scene. So let's just do that quickly. So go back to Houdini. There we go. I'll zoom out. And I'll just put in a height field remap. And a height field remap, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to say compute range. And right now you can see it's minus 128 to 133. So I'm just going to squash this down to maybe 60. Let's make it even, try it a little further down, 40. Yeah, I like that. So that's looking really good, and you can see that we got now a lot of detail with our lobing. It's looking actually pretty realistic. Let's go down one more, 30. Okay, I'm really happy with that. If I want to flatten off layers, something that I like to do is this is your remapping. So you can see you can remap and create areas that are flat for bottoms or mesas. I recommend that if you're going to do that, go here and say set interpolation to B-spline and set interpolation to B-spline. That way I don't get the hard delineations, I get a nice curve on it. Okay, so I'll do something like that. Great. So now what I could do is start filling in some detail. Height field paint. Shift right click, interactively increase the radius of my brush. And where do I want to have more elevation? Here, maybe along the ridges here, over here. And maybe over here too. I like that. Let's add a little more here. Okay. Like in H17, terrain has really become a painter's tool. It's so nice. So now I'm going to just do another height field noise. And we're just going to go and do that step one more time on the map. Go save just in case. And bring it to wherever you want. So I'd like it something like that. I think in my paint, what I'm going to do right after that is just blur it out a bit. So I'll do a high field blur. Just so I get a little smoother transition here. And now my noise. Got to increase my elements. Amplitude is fine. I want to decrease my amplitude just to get some little more detail there. Oh, I like that. That's looking interesting. And go through the same process again. I'll do another high field distort by layer. Get a high field noise going here. I'll just use something recent like this. Look at this guy, say instead of add, let's do a replace for my high field noise. And that looks interesting. Yeah, let's do it. So we got here, display scale, increase it. Just to give me some interest. I'll swirl, I'll smear, why not? And add some direction. Okay. So I'm ready to do one more erosion pass. High field mask clear. And again, this is the lobing section of it. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go here, grab my high field erode, Command C, Command V. Let escape. And the reason why it's taking long because you got the freeze at frame, so I'm going to turn that off right here. And let's just run it for that 25 frames. So we got now our flat levels that we had before. We remember we did a remap. Remap here to get us our water levels. So it's looking really nice. And we're ready to move on to our next section. So before I forget, freeze a frame. And now we can start going and detailing this out. Okay, so once the lobing process is done, it's time to sample up. As you can see on this map here, workflow, we sample up to a higher resolution so we get more detail, and we shape as needed. We might want to add some stuff. We do a reseeding, just like here, and we'll go through another erosion process with different settings in the lobing, and we might do this 2 times at different resolutions to get as much detail as you need. And then finally off to the shading. So let's look at an example of that. Okay, to resample, you just do a high field resample. And you come up here and you can say specify exact resolution. for the grid spacing, or really quite easily you could just say, I want to double the resolution like that. Okay, and if I go to I for information and it stays up, you can see that now we have a 1000 by 1000 meter. So now it's just 1 voxel per meter. And that's still very low, and processing will be very fast. Things to ask yourself: do I want the water right now? If not, what can I do? And also, do I like the debris as is, or do I want to make this kind of back into the regular soil? And that will be figured out in your high field erode. So if we go to the layers tab here, and we might want to say add water layer to the final, so it just elevates and smooths out a bit. And I should also mention that too. If you go to the Advanced tab, we have here 2 checkboxes. One for water flow post smoothing, okay, and that kind of makes sense. You don't want to have lumpy water as the erosion turns into water, the rainfall. So that will smooth it. And by default, debris flow is turned off for the post smooth because debris you usually want to be pretty lumpy. The only time you probably don't want your debris to be lumpy is if you're doing multiple road passes and it just starts to get too, how do I say it, like potholes everywhere. So you might want to turn that on, and you can see it just smooths everything out, which is just fine for your first pass. So I'll keep that on for here. Then I'll go and drop down another height field. And before I do height field erode, and before I do that, I'm going to make sure I have my timeline back to frame 1, just so it doesn't have to calculate everything. And just drop down another height field. And okay, so we got this guy going. Now in the layer setting for here, I might want to say, you know what, I want the debris not to be like this. I want to say that is actual soil. So I might want to say here, reset debris layer. And depending on if I want water or not, I might even want to reset the water layer. So I just have a plain high field with a lot of interesting stuff. Let's keep it like that for right now. And I'll run a new erosion, but with default parameters. And you can see that's looking a lot better already. And you can see that we got a lot of detail going on here between the different erosions. Wow, that's turning out really nice already. Things that I'm noticing that I probably would want to change is I'm liking the scalping, and I want it even more. I'll let the caps, in my case, end up in the very final resolution. So I'm going to just go back to high field erode. And in the Advanced tab, I'll go here to thermal erosion, and I'll do just a little more again, 0.8. I'll go to my main, and I'm going to say the cut angle, I'm even going to cut it more. I just want this really chiseled. And I'll change this maybe to 0.05 for the erosion rate of that thermal. So what I notice is that thermal really is the primary defining moment to get how you want your mountain tops to be scalloped. If you want them to be kind of smooth and rolling, change the cut angle to, well, let's do it together, like 60 or 50 or 40. 50 probably will do it. You'll see that we're not going to get much scalloping here. It stays pretty intact. Okay, I'll run this for a little while. You can see here it's nice and smooth. Okay, now let's change this down to something like 30. So what this is saying is any angle greater than 30 degrees, thermal erosion is going to start to really occur. Anything less than 30 degrees is just going to be kind of steady state and stable. So let's see the difference here. And you can really see how sharp these ridges are. that I didn't have that sharp ridge before. Let me zoom out and stop. There you go. So in this case, for me, it's now over sharpened. So I'll take one more pass, and I'll say, let's make it 40 degrees, and see if that's a nice compromise in my case aesthetically. Yep, I like that. And you can see how, again, it's just eroding really quickly. And I got lots of cool information here. Now, one of the things I'm noticing right now is, well, it all looks like it's doing the same thing as far as erosion. It's following the contours, the slope of the mountain, which is what it's normally supposed to do. But if you look at any mountain range, there's variations. Again, if there's these big granite slabs underneath, then there's no slabs underneath, then what might happen is you're going to get a different direction of your erosion. So how would I go about doing that? Well, if you look in the advanced, there is a grid bias. And if the value of 0 says, follow the contours, follow the slope, and that's where the erosion is going to occur, a grid bias of -1 is going to say, go in kind of a 90-degree change in one direction, and a positive one is going to be in the other direction. So what you could do here is you could go and turn on the mask. And you'll see it says Hydro Rigid Bias Mask. And if I click on the Grid Bias Paint, it will add a mask paint for me. And it will also add a copy layer. The copy layer is going to say our source is now going to be the hydrogen bias mask, and the mask paint will now be on the layer Hydro Grid Bias Mask. And so it will pick up those values as we're painting. So go to here, and I don't know, I'll just pick one area. Say this face here, and you're not going to see anything. Let me do it this way. Now you can see it. And I don't know, let's make it just this area here also. So I got 0 and 1, but I need it to remap it from 0 to 1 to a -1 to +1. So I'll just go height field remap. And I want to remap this guy. And I'll compute the range, and it's 0 to 1. And really what I want is where this guy is a -1. So I want it to go from 0 to -1 instead of 0 to +1. And now I'll redo. And we'll see certain areas that kind of look more like it's going straight down. And there we go. And it just adds a little more interest because it doesn't look like it's all the same. Like this area looks really interesting right now. And yet the other areas, are looking more traditional. And I can freeze. And let's do one more frame. 25. And I'm just really happy here. So what I'm going to do is just going to leave it all alone. And I'll just do one more height field resample. And in this high field resample, again, I'll double it up. To get even more detail. And other things I could do. So I'll leave the water there now. It looks good. Leave the debris. Don't have to worry about any of that stuff. But now I might go in again to the advanced setting. And I'm going to go to riverbed. And that's fine. Actually, I'm going to go down to, what do I want to do here? Going to increase the repose angle so it's not so sandy to maybe 30 degrees, kind of a little more realistic. And I'm going to go here. This max height is interesting. It's how much your debris can build up as a pile before it's kind of slumps, it falls over and starts to become kind of sediment washing down the mountain again. So if I were to crank this up to, let's say, 6, you should see some of these really interesting baselines, rings. Let's see. Now erosion is going to take longer. And there you go. You can see these lines. Now, this is not the classic Swiss Alps, but where I live in Gura Hills, California, when I drive the canyons, I see a lot of this type of debris where I get these rings, and you can adjust it. So the lower it is, the less of these you're going to have, the higher the value of your max height, the steeper these ledges are going to be. And you're going to say, okay, but why did I really need that? Well, think about your next step after you have your terrain is going to be decoration. And a lot of times, and that's way too much erosion for your final step, but a lot of times this is where you're going to have rock lines. So you're going to decorate with rocks like outcrops of big boulders, or it's going to be tree lines that are going to go around here. So let's go back to something more realistic, something like this. And there's my final erosion. Now, let's go down to where in the games you might, there we go, where you might have your actual walking and you can't have this lumpiness here. Okay, it's too lumpy. No problem. Again, I could do a height field mask by feature. And in a height field mask by feature, I might go here and say mask by slope, and I want the low slopes where they're probably going to be walking, so I'll say 0 and bring that up nicely to maybe 30 degrees just to get these little areas here. And then smooth radius, might bring that out a bit so it's just nice and smooth. And then I could do a height field blur on that. And now you got the great detail where your players are not going to be and where your players might be. It's nice and smoothed out, giving interesting information. So I'm going to go height field mask clear so you can see it. That's looking cool. Okay, so we got through the sampling up, we got through shaping, the reseeding if you wanted to. Ours was looking so good, I think I bypassed most of that. And then a couple layers of erosion. So I'm not going to talk about shaders and scattering yet. I want to jump straight to what's new in H17 for those who have been using terrain in H16. So let's go through the list of what's new to H17 as far as terrains go. So the first thing is you need far fewer frames needed to create erosion than 16.5. If you wanted to nitpick, the frames the erosion per frame is a little slower. But in H16.5, you would often do 45, 55 frames to get a good erosion. Now you're talking about between 15 and 25 frames to get to your sweet spot for erosion. So the net result is it's much faster. In H16.5 and 16, it was really hard to create big water channels. It took a lot of frames to let the water flow out and make kind of the rivers and the lakes. In H17, it's now really fast. It flows nicely. You can control it. You can get water quickly. All the major parameters now in 17 are controlled via masks. So you could really say, on this side of the mountain, there is a lot more rain than this side, or that one side of the mountain, there's a lot denser soil, so it doesn't erode as quickly. So there's all these masks that you could paint in. So you don't have to have symmetric mountains anymore. We did not do that in the quick overview, but we will be talking after this discussion of what's new about the masks and see how they work, because it's really interesting that now you can get really nice asymmetric mountain ranges. Control the amounts of feathering and fluvial lines. Well, we already saw that. There's other things that we could also do, but there's riverbed controls that will allow you to say how deep they are, when the erosion will kick over, and you'll see more debris. So just a lot of control there. Control the slope of the terrain where the thermal erosion kicks in. You saw that in the previous example when I changed the angle, the cut angle of the thermal erosion. We could get really sharp kind of scalloping in the mountains, or the smooth roundness of the tops of the mountains. Control the steepness of the riverbanks. So yes, we have the riverbanks and the riverbed controls now. And we can control the blurring and the size of raindrops, which we haven't looked at yet. So just in comparison, here is H16.5 after, I don't know, like 45 or 50 frames, and this is H17 after about 20 frames. And you can see we're getting a lot nicer detail all along. So what else? We control how far from peak the erosion starts. That was the 3 parameters that I showed you, where we say how many frames does it take to get to peak erosion, what's the influence of the slope, and where do we start in that erosion? Do we start from 0 and slowly build up, or do we go full force immediately? Control the grid bias. So now it's not just one type of erosion fluvial line going down following the slopes. We could actually skew it one way or the other, again, to create variation in your mountain ranges to make it look, well, more realistic. Okay, control how fast the erosion deposits debris. I showed you that, but I really didn't go into detail, but that is the sediment capacity. And in sediment capacity, you could say basically how much sediment can be held in water. So you saw in my case, I overcranked it because I didn't want debris to be dropped down while I was lobing. I actually want to see those fluvial lines really clean for the lobing process. So I overcranked it to 20. But in other cases, you might want to slow it down to, let's say, 5 to say that I want a lot of debris deposit. I want it to be muddy in certain areas. And again, this can be controlled by mass too. Control how after water carries sediment. Well, that's really bad grammar there. Well, we just talked about, though, how does the sediment carry the water? That was the sediment capacity. And now, this is really distinct from H16, is in H16, 16.5, we calculated flow for every erosion cycle. We've taken flow now out of the HF erode node and made it its own node called flow. That's a post-erode process, so it's much faster. And I haven't demonstrated that yet, but we will. So here is, examples of different ease in, ease out options for erosion. And you can see you get nicely different looks here. How much erosion do you want on the flatlands? Here's pretty smooth and pretty smooth. How much do you want scalping on the top? Slightly different here. So you have all those choices. In addition, we have a few new SOPs. We have the distort boundary layer that we talked about. We have a new erode hydro, erode thermal, and erode precipitation. So, well, what do I mean by edited here? Well, these are now comprised of, if you dove inside the actual HF erode, they're built in smaller HDAs. And so if you didn't want to go through a whole erosion process again, but you want to add more hydro erosion or more thermal erosion, you could append to an erode another thermal erosion, for instance, just to get that as a more of a greater effect. Okay, in Highfield slump, which we had in 1665, it was great for creating things like ski runs or areas where snow was going to be developed. It just slumps the terrain, so it's not so how'd you say, lumpy. But sometimes you want to add that granularness. You want to add something that looks like, it was coarse cement poured down. So we now added a granular node, or I should say granular option to slumping. So it's not just always smooth. You could say smooth or granular. So here we go. Here's the smooth slumping. And you can see here is the rough slumping. And you can see how we have that debris buildup on the rough and nice and smooth here. So let's go through HF erode in more detail now. Okay, so let's split off of HF erode 3, and let's just do another erosion off of that. So let's see, where do we want to go? Let's just take this Highfield erode 2 and do right after the resample. So I'm going to go Highfield erode, and just take it right after that resample there. Frame 1, good. And let's, go here to the main tab and talk about the main tab. So we have the global erosion rate, which is just a multiplier for all the other erosions. So you have erodibility here for hydro and a thermal erodibility. So these get multiplied by global erosion. So if I had something like here, a 2, then I would say 2 times the global rate. And if I have this as a 2, now it would be 4 times the rate. And the same thing goes with the thermal. So I'm going to just change that back like that. So that was pretty similar to H16.5. But let's look at now things like bank angle. So I got an erosion here, and the default bank angle is 70 degrees. So if I go here and just do an erosion off of it, you can see it's creating pretty sharp channels here. Okay, and that's 15 frames. That's good enough for you guys to see. Back to 15. The bank angle will say basically how soft is these water channels. So if I go here and change this to, let's say, 10 instead, and rerun this to frame 15, you notice we're not really getting those individual channels that we got before because it's just too soft. Oh, maybe even 10 degrees, even softer. So let's change this to, let's say, 40 degrees. What was the default? Revert to default, 70. So yeah, let's try 45 degrees. You can see I'm getting those individual channels now, but notice how soft they are. And this is something that you might want if you don't want to have so many jaggies, if you want to have a smoother terrain for your players to go over and so forth. And again, the other extreme is if you want to cut out really deep grooves, then you could change your bank angle to say 85. You do not want to go to 90. 90 would be the same equivalent as like 0 degrees, so just be aware of that. And here we go. And now you can see immediately, ready frame 5, you're really cutting out these steep grooves, very jaggedy. And again, depends on the look that you want. Okay, we already talked about this a bit. Let's change this back to its default of 70 degrees. The cut angle here for thermal. So the cut angle is if we have a slope like this, anything above or anything above 35 degrees is going to be cut. Anything below 35 degrees is going to remain the same. So if I had something here, let's say a cut angle of 70 degrees, almost nothing is going to be cut because almost everything here is above 70. So you're going to keep your caps pretty much as is. And what we're really seeing here is really the effects of hydroerosion, not thermal erosion. On the other hand, if I change this down to something severe like 25 degrees, you're going to see that almost everything's going to get cut, and I should be able to get really sharp spikes here. And I am. Look at that ridge line right there, and I'll zoom out. And the only reason why we're not getting these incredibly sharp spikes is because, remember in the Advanced tab, we went to the thermal erosion, and I could remove some more of that debris, and I'm going to remove some more of the hydro debris just so you can see it. So let's say 0.3, and then here at the erodibility adjustments, I'll make it 0 and 1, and now the erosion starts at the very peak, and now we will see that cut being very severe. And there we go. Nice sharp lines everywhere, but I am eroding way too much, and therefore that's why we're just getting these yikes, these ugly, as far as I'm concerned. Let's stop. Just very hilly things. So I'm going to go back here to main, change this to 35 degrees. Anything else I need to change here? Advanced removal rate. Then the rest should work just fine. It was just too much of a cut, so we're getting too much erosion being sloughed off, and it just piling up too much debris. So I'll just reset that again. And that looks much better. So now I have the sharp ridge lines, but I can see the definition also. So I did not mention about the erosion rates for hydro and thermal. So erodibility is how much erosion occur. It can be greater or less. The rates are how fast the erosions occur. So if I wanted, for instance, I don't know why I would, a very high erosion rate for thermal and slow hydro, I could do something like that, and it will give me a different look because it's now going to be driven mostly by the thermal erosion and very little by the hydro erosion. And you can see it's a vastly different look already. Okay, I'm going to set those back to default. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the advanced tab. So the removal rates. So we got a hydro removal rate and a thermal removal rate. And you can think of this as conservation of mass. So as the sediments and debris are going down the hill, how much are we going to take away from the actual soil? Like, imagine like wind is blowing away the dirt and revealing what's underneath. If you're very, concerned that you got to keep conservation of mass, then reduce the thermal rates. And as you can see that we actually now have negative values new to H17. Those negative values will allow you to add soil to the terrain over time. So think about it, if you have bedrock and it's granite, it's very dense and it occupies a small amount of space. But as it loosens up and is able to become debris, the volume it takes up will be greater because now it's not so densely packed. So again, removal rate default is 0.1 here. And let me change this also. So you can see what a default look like is and the debris coming up here. Let's stop that and do something like change this to a negative 0.3. So now we're saying that as the bedrock loosens up, it's going to expand more space, and therefore we're going to generate more soil. As you can see, early frames were already building up a lot more debris, a lot more soil, which is really cool that we could do that now. And same thing, I believe, goes with the thermal erosion. Let's try it out. Yep, negative values also. What would that look like here? That's a good question. I have not tested that out, so let's give it a quick test. And what I'm noticing immediately is that my peaks are now slumping off. They're staying pretty constant. I don't see much of a buildup. Well, maybe over here and here. But it is generating a lot more debris, and you can see how soft the area is here. So revert to defaults. Cool. Okay, the max debris depth. This is something that I almost never change. It allows how deep the grooves can be. And if you crank it up too high, you're going to get, well, let's take a look. You're going to get these bad pitting, is what I call them. And the best way to see the bad pitting up close is, I'll run this a few more frames, is underneath. You can see we're getting these kind of channels, too much of the channels falling through. And actually here it doesn't look that bad, probably because we don't have the removal rates that high. But it's something to be concerned of. If you just start to see that you're getting these kind of like these sinkholes that you don't want, really sharp angles, play with the max debris depth and lower it down. We discussed grid bias already. Grid bias allows you to change the angle that the sediment falls down, and therefore your fluvial lines will change. Let's go here, look at the default of 0. And you can see what we're getting over here. And over here, well, see here it's super steep, so the slope is just going to go straight down regardless. So it's kind of more the shell areas that you're going to notice a big difference. So let's stop there. Take a notice of this area, and maybe this area also. And then I'm going to change this to a grid bias of -1. And you can see how everything now is really fighting the slopage here of the previous one and trying to go straight down, creating a different type of erosion look. I kind of like it over here. It's a good example. It's just kind of going straight down. And if I stop it and go here to +1, you'll see it biasing the other way. And you can see this doesn't look natural at all here anymore because of these kind of stripes going straight up to this angle. But it's really good, and I highly recommend it if you have a larger terrain, to use a grid bias mask and add areas that does have this. It really breaks up the mountain range nicely, and it really does look more realistic because mountain ranges have different types of bedrock, granite, and underneath it that will sway the way that the flow of the fluvial lines go. Okay. Next up, we already talked about ramp-up iterations, but we really haven't seen the results, so I think that's what we should talk about next. So I apologize, I just experienced a power outage, so it's not the exact same terrain that we had before, but it's close. So let's just plow through. The next thing I want to talk about is masks. And as you can see in H17, we have lots of parameters now that have the capability of masks. And also, you can see that in the Advanced tab, also we have lots of things that have masks. So how do we use them? Well, I showed you one case earlier, but in general, when you have, let's say, the erodibility here, mask off, you turn it on and it gives you a new parameter. And that parameter will be de-highlighted for now because for all masks in 17, it's channeled into the second input of the erode node. So as soon as I wire this in like that, you'll see that this is now highlighted. Now earlier we saw that we could just click on the paint tab, and let me just cut this off. There you go. So you can see it's de-highlighted, and it looks like I made it Y instead. So let's do this. Start fresh. There you go. Main, erodibility, I'll go mask on. There's the mask. You saw that I could go here and click on the mask paint, and it'll add 2 layers for you, or 2 operators, I should say, a mask paint and a create hydroability mask, erodibility mask. And each one has a different name. And you can just paint where you want the erodibility to be. But let's say you don't want to paint, you want to do it more procedural. So let me delete this. And I still have the mask on. So I could, for instance, do a height field mask by feature. And I'll say I want the slopes there, but I want to also do it by direction. So on goal angle, I'll do a spreader like this. Let's do the opposite. So everything going over here, I want a high erodibility. On this side of the mountain, I want a low erodibility. So I just create it like that. Then I just do a height field copy layer. And wire this in. Copy the name of the mask because I'll never type it correctly. From mask to the destination. There we go. And what I want to do is make sure erodibility is 1. So it becomes a scalar multiplier of my mask that I created right here. So now, if I run this erosion, you can see that I'm getting really good erosion of these slopes and almost nothing here, depending on the fall off. Let's just spin it around so you can see erosion, no erosion. And again, I can exaggerate that. I'll reset this. Let's zoom in. If I were to overcrank this to an erodibility of, let's say, 3, then you can see I'm getting no erosion on this side of the hill at all and getting good erosion over here. So that's another way of doing your mask, and probably the way you're going to do it more often than you're going to paint. Another way to do it is by noise. So let's say we got that erodibility, and then we want to say the amount of precipitation. So we'll make the mask on here. And again, I'll set this to 1 for precipitation. And this time, I don't know, instead of using a mask by feature, I'm going to say a height field noise, a height field mask noise. And instead of combine method add, I'll just say replace because I already moved this to the erodibility mask. So I'm going to replace this with just the regular mask. Amplitude is going to be 1, and I'm going to decrease this so it's sharper. And do I have a OpenGL issue? Let's see. Yes, I do. Let's see if we can get this. Copy layer. Okay, that's looking much better already. And I'm just going to go here. And why not do a height field wrangle? If at mask is less than, let's say, 0.5, at mask gets assigned 0. So we got these areas are going to have rain. These areas are not going to have rain. And then I got to do another height field copy layer. And I'll reset my erosion here. And this guy is called precipitation. So we're going to go mask to precipitation, like that. Height field erode. I changed the mask around, so to be safe, I'm going to go reset simulation. Make sure that this is zeroed out. Now only certain areas are going to have rain dropped on it. So again, it will change the effect of the erosion. And if I again want to overcrank this, I could, overcrank it that way because it's just going to act as a multiplier. And there you go. So you're going to have a different effect on your erosion. Good things to do about this is if you just want concentrated areas of rain in the high elevations and keep the rest the same, you just paint in the little peaks that you want to have rain and leave the rest as 0, and you'll just see the erosion effects take place in the higher elevation peaks going down the side of the mountain. So that's just another way of doing masks. I should mention here, as you get higher up, this density. It's really important because it's going to say basically the smaller the number, the more channels of erosion you're going to have, the finer the feathering is going to be. So if this were like really a gross setting like 0.1, you're going to see this kind of all coalesce together. Again, it depends on the resolution also. And if you set this to a nice low number, you'll see fine channels being created. And in this case, too fine, so it can't even, find a channel for you. So let's go to 0.02. And there you go. You're seeing that you're getting these thinner veins than you had before. Okay, the evaporation rate is just what it says. If you crank up the amount of precipitation, you're going to obviously have more water going down. But if you also crank this up, you're saying is I want a high amount of rain, but I also want it to evaporate quickly, and therefore you're not going to have big lakes here. You're going to get the fluvial lines, and then it will just evaporate before it could pool. And right now, I probably should go here to height field layer and say reset water layer so we don't see the old water. So we can see where it is pulling the water right now. But if I were to go back to the advanced layer and say evaporation is 2, so it's really 2. So it's really close to the precipitation amount. You're going to see the debris form quicker because it's just going to get stuck because there's not enough water to move the sediment down the channel. You're going to get a much muddier look. Let's talk about raindrop settings. So I'm going to go here first and just revert to defaults my evaporation rate. So we get some water. And if you expand the raindrop settings, you'll see a radius, expand radius, and a blur radius. So both of these are really useful. If you get lots of thin little channels, and I'm trying to see where I could get a little thin channel for you. Let's stop it right there. Yeah, let's say here. And you don't really like this thin. You'd rather have, instead of all these zigzags here, kind of one continuous piece. What you could try to do is you could expand the radius of the raindrop settings, make them basically fatter drops of water. So I'll bring this up to something like here and rerun. You can see it's causing these guys to be thicker channels going down the hill. And now let's see if I stop this. Yeah, frame 17. Yeah, I got those big raindrops, and it's kind of creating this kind of ugly just slosh here for me. And it's just too severe. I could say let's increase the blur radius a bit. So now each raindrop has a little blur to it. Causing it to have softer lines. And you can also see this, if we zoom out, in our lakes. Our lakes are much softer with the blur here. They kind of creep onto the shore nicer. Let's zoom back out, redo it, and now I have my blur radius is 0. And you can see it's a harder line. As far as expand radius, I do it really judiciously, like a 0.5, a 0.2. Something really small, or else you're going to get kind of that big mushiness. And see, that's looking better over here. It's not as mushy if we go into the details here. And again, stop. I will put a little blur on there, just to blur it out and smooth it. So that's what those parameters are for. I'll zoom out. And that's looking pretty good there. Okay, let's talk about quantization next. There's two quantizations here. There is debris flow quantization and water flow quantization. Let me revert to defaults on the water, and let's reset the simulation to make sure that we have a nice clean simulation going. So debris flow quantization is about how chunky is the debris. The smaller the value, the smoother the debris is going to be. So let's make this a 0.1 value and run this simulation. We'll run it for like 15 frames. That's all we need to see. And you can see how smooth the flow of debris is. It's like a very liquidy mud. It just, doesn't clump up anywhere. On the other hand, if I were to take this to, let's say, 2.5 and run the same simulation, you would see quite instantly how grainy everything is. So if you need something grainy or smooth, this is a good place to play with it. Again, the negative of this is where you're going to have your characters playing. It's going to look really awful there. You're going to have to do some other type of smoothing. Quantization should be used sparingly in small values, if you ask me. So again, the default is 0.25. Even we make it 0.5 here, and let's rerun that. You can see you're already getting a nice chunkiness that you could work with. On the other hand, I'm going to revert to defaults here. The quantization of water I find less useful. It's going to make these potholes of water if you increase it too much. So let me turn off post smooth first and show you the default there. Without post smooth on, we're already getting these little kind of pits here that you can see. And so the post smooth will just kind of smooth out those water areas and make them nice and clean. But if I increase this to, let's say, 0.2, and I guess I should have turned off post smooth so you can see it better. Let's reset the simulation. And actually, I'll make this much larger so you can see it exaggerated. At 2. There you go. Now you can see already how these big, large drops are really creating these pits into the terrain that are pretty ugly. And post smoothing, I do not think will help it at this level that much. Yeah, you got these really gnarly, deep crevices, and you can see it really badly, these spikes on the bottom. So again, a little quantization, increasing it is fine, but be very, very, subtle in how you adjust these things to get the effect that you want. Next on the list is water absorption under debris flow. Don't think about it as water absorption. Think about it as what it does for debris. The higher the value for water absorption, the bigger the buildup on the sides of water flow. So the default is 1, and it's rare that you're going to want to change it. And you can see here where I have the water flow, I got debris on the sides of the water flow here. That's the dark brown. But if I were to change it to the opposite end, 0 for instance, then you can see that I really don't have any debris buildup around the water channels itself. It's kind of just blending in everywhere. So for the most part, you want to keep it as default as 1. It'll give you the most natural looks. Okay, we already talked about max height. Remember, that is how much debris will build up before the flow knocks it over and goes down the hill again. So let me change the water absorption back to the default of 1. And we have not talked about repose angle. The repose angle is just like in H16.5. It's the idea of when the debris goes down, how does it clump? Does it be like fine sand and just be at a very low angle, just filling up the space? Or is it really, thick, kind of granular debris that will pile up on each other? So let's make it a really low repose angle. And you can see that debris is really flat. It just keeps on going, and it really doesn't build up anywhere. It just kind of spreads and spreads and spreads. On the other hand, if I were to make my repose angle something artificially high, let's say 75 degrees, what you're going to see is the debris start to just pile up on itself, and you can see it already evident right here. And here's the circles here of it trying to pile up and stack up. And there's a good case for both of these. Again, it depends on your soil type. You'll notice that repose angle does have a mask, and that's really quite useful. So if I have areas, let me reset and zoom out, where I have a steep cliff like right here, I might want to have a mask that has a really high repose angle in this area. And areas that are kind of much more shallow, like here, have a low repose angle to have kind of, well, this was a big granite slab, and when I had debris rolling off of this, it's going to pile up thickly. This is going to be probably a lot less bedrock, a lot more thin soil, so when it builds up, it'll build out in a shallower angle. Good repose angles are probably between 15 degrees at the very low end, which is what we have as our default, to, I would say, 35 degrees. So back in my workflow here, we talked a lot about sampling up, about erosion, about going back and forth in this loop a few times, about remapping, but I really didn't talk about shaping much. And we do have a few shape tools like Highfield Terrace in the Highfield tools, so let's look over those a bit. So I froze my erosion that we were playing with at frame 20, and now let's say I want to take certain areas and terrace them, just again to break up the geological formations here. So I'm going to go to Highfield and I'll just say terrace. And I'll say compute range, and you can see everything is being terraced right now. Kind of cool. There are certain things that we could do here. Terrace step size, so right now it's at 40 meters. If I decrease it, you can see I get a lot more terracing. And as I get smaller in my terracing, it gets kind of muddied. And the reason for that is the smooth edges. So I can go here and decrease the smooth edges to get it back to the sharpness I want. Now obviously I didn't want to terrace everything. So I have here in my height layer a paint tool. Just click on it, I get my paint. And now, just make my brush a little larger. I'll just terrace in the areas I want. Like that. Another thing we have is, well, before we do that, right now it's very, very sharp and mechanical. A good thing to do with this is just do a high field distort by noise afterwards. We already have our mask, so I could go in here, and instead of distorting everything, just mask it out, the areas I want. And then I'll go in here and say amplitude a little more, and memory decrease the element size, just to break it up a bit. And there you go. And again, you can do other things like just add a little top noise on it, high field noise. And bring down the amplitude to, maybe 5 meters, and the element size to, 20. As you can see, so we just get a little more undulation in it, so it looks more natural. Another thing we could do is we could slump areas. And slump is looking for a mask. Right now we have just a mask everywhere. And so if I were to put this in here, you can see it would be slumping these areas and kind of, as if you had a mudslide going on. But I could go in here and do another high field mask paint. Or let's do a draw mask this time, just to show you the difference. And I'll go in and just say I want a mudslide in this area. And then in the slump controls, spread iterations, how smooth you want that to be, or how sharp. The spread rate, the repose angle, again we're slumping, so we're keeping it really low so it's fine sand. And do I want to have a height factor or no? Here, no. And you can just custom control how you get your wipeout. Again, go back to my draw mask, draw in this area, and you can see how it's working. And then do a high field mask clear at the end so you can actually see what's going on. And there you go. So you can see that I got some nice wipeout areas that are not tabletop flat. It works. Slumping really works well to what I call organify things. Okay, what else do we have? We have a high field clip. So if you don't want all the peaks you have here, you could say high field clip, compute range, and it says, okay, I want to knock those guys out right there. And you can see I could soften the range by my max clip height. It does take a mask, so if you want to just, say I only want to work in a certain area, for instance this area, I could go and do, let's just do another one, high field mask. This time let's do by object. So I'll bring the high field here. I'll draw, I don't know, a box. Make my box 150, 150, 150. And I'll wire that in here. And so now I can make that my mask for my clip. Move it into an area. Make sure to intersect something. And you can see it's only in that bounding box region that you'll get it. And what's nice about objects is look how quickly it moves, so I could move it to a different area and just clip that area. Like that. Anything else you should know about that? In the mask by object, a couple things is there's a blur radius, so you could soften the edge so it's not so extreme. Also in the clip there is a minimum clip, so if I didn't have that mask on, so let's just bypass the mask, I could say anything lower than a certain value gets clipped also. Let's just cut that, compute range, and minimum clip. You can see I could just cut off that whole bottom area. Okay, and let's get rid of that clip. We didn't need it. We don't need this mask by object anymore. You've seen height field mask by feature, which is kind of my go-to for masking, because I could do all sorts of things like saying mask by height, compute the range. I only want the top areas to be taken care of here. And I want to make sure that in that area, I don't care about the slope, but I care about the direction. So I can say what my goal angle of this direction is going to be, and the spread. So let me go down here so you can see how it's changing in rotation. We also now have a mask by occlusion. So let's turn off the direction so it can figure out, what areas are occluded, and you can use that to kind of calculate your ridges and your valleys, which is quite cool. But besides that, we have something new to, I think, 16.5 and 17, height field mask by occlusion, so you don't have to go through all those features. And there it is by itself. And it has things like what the view distance is, the step scale, the number of searches for the occlusion, so you could get better and lower quality, what you want the minimum occlusion to be set at. So right now you can see that I was able to target the ridges pretty well. One thing that I want to show you before I wrap up this video is if we go to, let's say, a road 3 here, and we look at the information tab here, you'll notice that when we do a road in 17, we get the mask, we get the bedrock, sediment, height, debris, and water. What we don't get is flow. There are two ways you're going to get flow right now. The first way is right here where we did a slump. If I look at my slump, I will get a flow direction XYZ added to it. But if I'm not going to use a slump, then how do I calculate flow so I can use it, let's say, in the game engine? And in 16.5, remember, flow was calculated every frame of the road. But now it's a post process. So all you have to do here is hit tab, height field flow. And it takes a bit. It gets calculated once. And there is your flow. And you can see in the information that I now have the flow added to my model. So the last thing I want to talk about in this video is how do I get my height field / terrain out into other DTCs or game engines. And the simplest way is just to save out the maps as images. And we could do that with a height field output. And a height field output is going to ask for a few things. It's going to ask what do you want to name your file. And I have a foo.exr on my desktop, so I'll just write it over it. And then it's going to say, okay, so you have red, green, blue, and alpha channels. What do you want to stick in those things? So probably the most important thing here would be the height. And then it's going to ask me the output range. No remapping for linear format. We're doing auto remap from a 0 to 1 range, or whatever range you want. In green, let's say that's my debris. Auto remap. Then comes the blue, water. And then the last one, I don't know what we want. We'll do auto remap for the alpha. Maybe we want to look at, I did have some mesas, so maybe I want to look at the mesa top so I can plan certain things at the top there. And auto remap. And then I just go save to disk. And if I go to mplay, it really is the best way to look at it. So let me open up mplay. And I'll go to desktop and say foo.exr, load. And there's my RGB alpha, but if I look at the individual channels, there's my height, there's my debris, water, and my mesas. So that's one way of doing things. Another way of doing this would be to output it just as a height field. And you could do that with a ROP output. And specifically here would be a ROP geometry output. And you guys know how to do that, so I'm not going to go through that. Another way is to convert it first to geometry. And you can use a convert height field for that. And there's a few options. You want to convert to a polygon soup, a VDB. We're going to say a polygon here. And then you have to choose, do you want it just as a kind of a skin, like this? Or do you want to extrude a base? And that will take a bit of time, because in this case there's a lot of polys. And that way it will give you a nice base. Let's do smooth shaded. So you can see it actually creates this base for you, which is nice. I'm going to convert it back here to without a base. And then say, one of the things you probably want to do here is do a poly reduce, because that's a lot of geometry, and I probably hit the L key. So let's go and find it again. Here it is. And do a poly reduce before you output it. And if you didn't know, a good thing to do here in the poly reduce is set it to something really low. I'll set it to 1%. And it might take a little time to calculate. But the beauty of it is once it's calculated as super low, it's saved the intermediate steps. So it's really fast if you want to save 5% of the polygons, whatever you need to make it look good. So here we are at 1%, and it's a bit mushy for me. So, let's make it 5%. And you can see immediately get more detail, and now I can export. And then I'll just use, again, a ROP geometry output for that. Another thing you do is drop down a COP network. And in the COP network, use a SOP import node. And then you just point to whichever height field you want. Let's say just road 3, because I can't remember the name right now. And I'll open up this guy. And you're going to say set resolution from SOP and set planes from SOP. And now you can go here and you go, here's my height field and here's my debris, and do everything that you would do in a compositor. So in the next video I produced for you guys, I'll go through the new height field scatter, which is just an amazing operator and will make life much simpler for you when you want to lay down villages, buildings, cities, trees, bushes, rocks, and debris in a hierarchical way. So stay tuned, and I really do appreciate that you slugged it out and listened to me for 2 hours. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed it.